Hello learners, I welcome you to the course Environmental Politics, Theories, Concepts and Debates. I am Professor Preeti Singh from Department of Political Science, Vasanta College for Women, Rajghat, Varanasi. In this 8-week course, I'll be engaging first 4 weeks and last 4 weeks will be covered by Dr. Punita Pathak. This is the first week and first lecture of the first week. In this week, we will try to understand rise and growth of environmentalism. We'll try to understand how all these debate on environmentalism, environmental concern started. What was the context which led to emergence of environmentalism? And basically, what do we mean by environmentalism? There's a long debate on the definition of environmentalism because there are various perspectives to define environmentalism. But to have a basic understanding, we can talk about environmentalism as a perspective which keeps environmental concerns at the center and tries to investigate the causes of environmental crisis and explores the possibilities of finding out solution to these crises. This can be a general meaning of environmentalism. However, its definition and the debate on its definition is very complex, which we will be covering in coming lectures. Since it is the first lecture, we'll begin with giving you a brief outline about the course, what we are going to cover in this 8-week course. In week 1 and 2, basically we will talk about the theoretical aspect associated with environmentalism, various concepts, various theories and ideologies. Week 3 and 4 will focus on environmental movements at the global level and in India. Week 5 will cover environmental politics and environmental advocacy, mainly green political parties and pressure groups. In week 6, we will cover major global initiatives taken to address environmental concern. And week 7 and 8 will talk about environmental governance at the global level and in India. So these are the aspects which we are going to cover in this 8-week course. Now about the first week. First week, as I mentioned, that will focus on rise and growth of environmentalism. So these are the aspects which we will cover in week 1, waves of environmentalism, political theory and environmental concern, nature of green ideology, and major concepts of environmentalism. And in today's lecture, we will talk about waves of environmentalism. So firstly, we'll talk about that. Why do we need to discuss human-nature relation? What is the debate on that? Actually, when we talk about a relationship between nature and humans, so it has gone through many phases. The initial phase, which can be called pre-modern times. So this was the phase where human society was controlled by nature. It was dependent on it. And nature was often seen as a mystical power beyond human comprehension. And this situation led to the practices of nature worship. Now, with the advent of modern science and technology, humans got the capacity to understand, explain nature, and now nothing remained mystical about it. So human beings got the capacity that they can explain every aspect of nature and various natural events and processes. But what is important to observe that humans did not confine the use of science and technology only to understand and explain natural events, natural processes. They started applying it to control nature. And here the relation between nature and humans got converted into a relationship of owner and owned. Nature became the object to be controlled, used, and exploited. Human beings started claiming that they have a proprietary right over nature. And this was the point where the relationship with environment became asymmetrical and unequal. What is important that this asymmetrical and unequal relationship, on the one hand, uh, put extra pressure on nature, lead to exploitation of nature, but on the other hand, it also led to existential crisis for humanity by disrupting ecological balance. And it was the result of this ecological disbalance that we are facing many environmental crises, and now these crises have become a global concern. The challenges like population overgrowth, biodiversity loss, deforestation, decline in wildlife population, climate change, these are the major challenges of the present time. Forests are shrinking. We are getting reports. A very important report is the Global Forest Resource Assessment report that says that the world has lost 178 million hectares of forest since 1990. Climate change has taken a very uh, drastic shape. Greenhouse gas emission is increasing, and this is the state. This alarming state basically uh, led to a condition where we are forced to respond to the environmental concern. We need to look for solutions and alternatives. So, environmental politics and ecological thinking have emerged basically as a response to the above situation, where human society realized that unless and until they address these concerns, their very survival is going to be threatened. So, this is the context which made this debate essential. We need to think again and again about our relationship with nature. Now, I will talk about that when these environmental concerns became a matter of debate among social scientists. In fact, it can be called a period during 1960s, 70s. Before that, primarily the environmental processes and environmental events drew attention of natural scientists. If we talk about the origin of the term ecology, so we will find that this term was used for the first time in 1860s, and it was defined as the science of relations between organisms and their environment. So, as I said, that ecology for a long time was seen as a phenomenon to be studied by the scientists in natural sciences. Social science in the beginning, it didn't pay attention to relationship between nature and individual. It was not its primary concern. Why? Because basically social science was interested in understanding, explaining, and analyzing the social phenomena, which included individuals' relation with group, with society, various social institutions, various social processes. These were the major concern of social science. Human society, its problem, and search for a good society. Mainly, social science focused on these aspects. But what happened that by the mid of 20th century, when environmental crisis took an acute shape, then it was realized that when we are talking about good society, so any narrative of good society must address the question of human society and nature, a relation between humans and nature. Without addressing this, any narrative of good society would remain incomplete. And it was this realization which drew attention of social scientists towards environmental concern. Because by this time it became clear that without rethinking the existing patterns of relationship between humans and nature, the very survival of humanity is going to be threatened. And we can say that it was the period when the term ecology got a political meaning. And across discipline in social sciences, scholars started engaging in understanding the nature of the problem and what could be the possible solutions to the problem. So this is how social science got involved into studies of environmental issues and concerns. Now we will try to understand that what are the various viewpoints on the origin of environmental thinking. Now, the thing is that what do we mean by environmental thinking? Environmental thinking can be defined as when human society start reflecting on its relation with nature, and second, start finding out the ways how can they align their activities, their way of life with the realities of nature. So this way of thinking can be called environmental thinking. So basically two things. First, awareness about environmental concern, and second, a sensitivity towards environmental concern. So we'll see that what are the various viewpoints regarding origin of environmental thinking. One viewpoint says that its roots can be traced in the primitive age. This viewpoint argues that this complex relation between nature and human, the strained relation, is a modern invention. Why? Because if we look at the way of life of the primitive society, so this viewpoint argues that it was eco-friendly. Primitive societies had a very strong bond with nature. And due to this bond, they had a natural ancient wisdom. They had the capacity to uh, realize the needs of the nature and also to align their activities with nature. And this group suggests what? That if we really want to deal with the present ecological crisis, what do we need? We need to revive this ancient wisdom. However, there are critics who say this kind of idealization of human nature relationship in the ancient times ignores a number of facts. It ignores that the human society since the beginning, in order to survive, has intervened into the domain of nature. However, its capacity to intervene in nature in the later phase became more strong and its impact could be felt. But, like if I refer to Andrew Vincent's viewpoint, he says what? That the fact that slash and burn mentality and the disregard for pollution and habitat destruction, it was also a very important characteristic of early Neolithic human beings. So to say that the way of life of the primitive societies were eco-friendly, some of the critics argue that it is a kind of idealization of human nature relationship in the ancient times and which ignores number of facts. Now, the second viewpoint, which can be called the most dominant viewpoint, which says that environmentalism emerged somewhere during 1960s and 70s. And it emerged as a response to overconsumption and misuse of natural resources. Why? Because by this time, the impact of this overconsumption and misuse can be witnessed. Like Brian Toker argues that the real origin of the Green Movement is in the great social and political upheavals that swept the United States and the entire Western world during the 1960s. It was this period where number of major writings and reports raising environmental issue, creating awareness on environmental issue got published. To name a few, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, unofficial UN report, Only One Earth, then the Limits to Growth report, Blueprint for Survival report. There are a number of reports which came during this period only. And this increased environmental awareness during 1970s that led to emergence of green organization, green political parties who were engaged in green politics. Now, what is green politics or eco politics? We can say which keeps environmental concern at the center, which consider environmental concern as the major political agenda, and therefore they raise the issues like environmental protection, conservation, climate change, environmental security, and peace. So this started somewhere in 1960s and 70s, and this viewpoint regarding emergence of environmentalism or regarding emergence of environmental thinking is the most accepted viewpoint. Now we will talk about waves of environmental thinking and environmental politics. Before I start how different scholars have divided environmental thinking and environmental politics into different waves, firstly, I think we need to understand this wave framework or wave method. You see, whenever we have to understand the development of any movement or any theory which has grown over a long period of time and which has been dynamic in nature, that means which has keep on shifting its nature. So what we do in that case, we try to divide this long development into different phases, what we call waves. And how do we divide it? On the basis of similarities of issues, methods, strategy, we keep one phase as one wave. And that point where we find that the movement has or the ideology has taken a major shift, then we say a second wave has started. So this method helps you to understand a long development. It helps you to comprehend that development. And also it helps you to analyze the points of major shift. Like if I can give you an example of feminist theory. If you have studied feminist theory or feminism, you must have heard of first wave, second wave, third wave. Now we are talking about fourth wave and fifth wave of feminism. So what feminist scholars generally do? They say the feminist movement that started in the late 19th century and early 20th century, that can be called first wave, then mid of the 20th century, second wave, 1990s, third wave. This kind of classification actually makes it very easy to understand the continuity and change in any movement or in any ideology. It has certain limitation also. Why? Because when you divide development into waves, sometimes there may be a possibility that when you are saying that this is one wave, so inner diversity of that wave may not be properly examined. That can be a possibility. But the positive aspect is that we can understand a long develop in a very systematic way. Like If I talk about environmental thinking or environmental politics, so even if we consider its beginning in 1960s, so you see we have covered a long period. Now, one more point which you need to keep in your mind when we talk about waves of feminism. So you see there is a kind of consensus among most of the feminist scholars on these timing of the waves. There is a kind of consensus in feminist literature that this is the first wave, this is the second, and this is the third wave. But when we talk about waves of environmentalism, so that kind of consensus is not there. Why? Because there are scholars who may start this classification of waves from 19th century also, and there are other scholars who say that this waves of environmentalism start somewhere from 1960s and 70s. So what we will do now, that we will see how different scholars have divided environmentalism into different waves. So to begin with, Timo Riordan, who classifies environmental thinking in three waves. First, the early romantic period, or the romantic period in literature, where figures like Wordsworth, Emerson, they started writing on nature. They started talking about the relation between nature and humans, and it was a kind of also critical approach to the Enlightenment thinking, which talked everything in terms of science and technology. So this can be called the first wave, where in the early romantic period, figures like Wordsworth, Emerson, Thoreau, they started talking about nature and human, the beauty of nature, the spiritual connect between nature and human. The second wave, according to Riordan, start from 1900 to 1920. You see, this was the period when initial conservationist movement started, where the environmental technocrats started talking about the programs like reforestation, soil conservation, to conserve environment. There has been debate on what was the purpose of conserving environment, but it was the period when this whole debate on conserving environment started. Now the third wave, that started from the mid 1960s, where environmental concerns became acute, and therefore it led to public debates, formation of pressure groups, and development and institutionalization of environmental regulation. So this is how Team O'Riordan tries to divide environmental thinking into three waves. Now the second, Lowe and Goiter, they divide environmental politics in four waves. Now you can see they are starting from 19th century, 1880s up to 1900, then 1918 to 1939, then 1950s and early 1970s. They made a very interesting observation. Their observation was that all these phases of environmental activism or emergence of environmental group was preceded by a period of material growth. They argue what? That it is perhaps no coincidence that each of the periods of sudden growth of new environmental groups in the 1890s, 1920s, 1950s, and 1970s occurred as similar phases in the world business cycle towards the end of periods of sustained expansion. So it appears that after fulfillment of material needs due to increase in economic prosperity, people started realizing that what ecological cost has been paid for this material prosperity. So this is how Lowe and Goiter classify environmental politics into four waves. Next classification is done by Matthew Humphrey, who divide the literature on the green theory into three waves since 1960. So his division starts from 1960s. The first wave basically, according to Humphrey, aimed at creating awareness about ecological issues. He says what that eco doomsday scenario placed environmentalism on the political map permanently. You see, if we see the 1960s, in the beginning, number of reports came which said we are heading towards a very disastrous situation because of our consumption pattern, because of our excessive intervention in natural process. So this was creating awareness. And that's why Humphrey says that this eco doomsday scenario actually made environmental issue a kind of matter of debate among political circles. Now, the second wave, Humphrey says, was a critical wave, which mainly consisted of the responses to the writings of the first wave. So, in the first wave, we did talk about creating awareness. Now, in the second wave, there was a focus on what are the causes of these ecological challenges and what can be the possible solutions to it. Now, this wave was full of diversity. Why? Because in this wave, the critiques came from different disciplines. They took different philosophical perspective and having diverse ideological positions. So the second wave seems to be more uh, diversified wave. And then the third wave. Humphrey says that the third wave is a more reflective, nuanced, and critically aware. Now they raise deeper questions, questions on epistemological, ontological, economic, and political assumption of the first wave literature. So that's why Humphrey says that the third wave appears to be more reflective and critically aware. So this is the classification done by Humphrey. Now the last classification is done by Shalit, who divides the growth of environmentalism into three stages. First stage is where the limitations of the anthropocentric values in understanding relation between man and nature was uncovered. Now you see, there is a term used, anthropocentric value. There are two, three terms which will keep on coming in this whole course, like anthropocentric, ecocentric. So, what is anthropocentric? When we keep human needs at the center in the process of defining human nature relationship, that would be called anthropocentric values. Another can be ecocentric value. When we see this whole ecosystem in terms of that it consists of various entities and they all have equal values. Humans are not supposed to be at the center. Every entity in this ecosystem has their inherent value. So this framework would be called ecocentric perspective. So what Shalit is saying that first stage uncovered the limitation of anthropocentric value. It was realized that this anthropocentric focus in understanding relation between man and nature is problematic. The second stage, what is called metaethics, it says that now what do we need? We need to develop a new philosophical formulation. So in place of anthropocentric philosophical formulation, now what is required? I can say ecocentric formulations are required to address ecological concern. Now, eco-theorists emphasize the need of conceptualizing a new ethics, a new metaphysics, and a new religion, which will be based on a harmonious relationship with nature. It was this phase where terms like ecosophy, ecoethics became popular. Like one very important name is Aldo Leopold, who emphasized that there is a need to extend ethics from human world to the non-human world. So till now we were saying that when we talk about ethical concern, it is mainly concerned with human relationship. But now it was realized, no, the ethical standards should be applied also to non-human world. So this was a major shift. Now the third stage is political theory. Now the environmental awareness, which was at the very abstract, intuitive, subjective and philosophical level in the previous stages, now it got linked to environmental consciousness. And this was the phase where the environmental concerns are gradually started being seen as political issues. And there was a debate that now we need rethinking at the level of political institutions, political processes, and political mechanisms. And this is the point we can say where green theory got linked to political theory. So these are the various stages or waves of environmentalism according to Shalit. So we try to understand how different scholars have tried to divide environmental thinking or environmental politics into different waves. These are some of the references that I have used in this lecture, and you can go through these references as further reading to have a deeper understanding about the waves of environmentalism. Now, you see, these are some activity questions. After every lecture, we will give you certain activity questions. These questions would not be graded questions, but the objective of these questions are only to help you assess your own learning, that how much you have learned. If you can answer these questions, that means you have learned the expected outcome. So here I have given 3 activities. First, you have to examine the factors which made environmentalism a dominant ideology during 1970s. Second, do you think that primitive societies were eco-friendly? Give relevant examples. So while answering this question, what you are expected to do is that you need to collect the information regarding the way of life followed by primitive societies and then try to analyze that from an ecological perspective. I have given a link to the video on climate change. I expect you to go through that video and then write an essay on the impact of climate change. So thank you learners for joining the session. This was the first lecture, so it was only an introductory discussion on rise and growth of environmentalism, where we try to understand that how different scholars have divided environmentalism, environmental thinking into different waves, and why do we need a debate on human nature relationship. So thank you so much for joining the lecture, and now we'll meet in the next lecture.